What drives a man to believe that blood is the only thing keeping him alive? In the winter of 1977, Sacramento would find the answer. For 1 month, a killer moved through the city, entering homes at random, leaving behind bodies that showed the depths of his madness. 6 people died before he was caught. His name was Richard Chase. The world would come to know him as the Vampire of Sacramento. It was just after Christmas. The air was cool, the evenings darker, and families across the city were winding down from the holiday rush. On a quiet street, a man named Ambrose Griffin was stepping outside his home with his wife. He was 51 years old, a father and a husband. His life, by all accounts, was steady, unremarkable, and ordinary. That night, the Griffins were unloading groceries from the car. Ambrose's wife carried a bag in her arms. Ambrose moved slowly, his health weakened by a recent illness, but there was no urgency. It was the kind of mundane evening every family knows. Bringing food inside, preparing for dinner, settling into the rhythms of winter. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A loud crack split the air. Ambrose stumbled. His wife turned, confused, as another crack followed. He fell to the ground, clutching his chest. The groceries scattered across the driveway. At first, she thought he had collapsed from his condition. But as she knelt beside him, she realized the truth. Ambrose had been shot. 2 bullets had been fired from a passing car. One tore into his chest, piercing his heart. The Griffins' quiet evening had been shattered by a stranger they had never met, a man whose world was far from ordinary. That man was Richard Chase. At the time of the shooting, Chase was 27 years old, already consumed by delusions that his body was rotting. He believed his heart would stop unless he replenished himself with blood. In his mind, blood was medicine. On that December evening, he took his .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol and drove aimlessly through the neighborhood. To him, the people he passed were not families or neighbors. They were potential sources of sustenance. As Ambrose Griffin bent to carry groceries, Chase fired from his moving car. A random act, a test, the beginning of what would soon spiral into a frenzy of violence. Police were called immediately. The shooting looked at first like a drive-by. Sacramento officers arrived at the scene, interviewing Ambrose's wife and family, searching for shell casings and canvassing the neighborhood. They recovered 2 spent casings from a .22 caliber gun. Witnesses reported a brown Pontiac cruising the area before the shots were fired. But there were no suspects, no known enemies, and no obvious motive. Ambrose had no ties to gangs, no history of disputes, no reason to be targeted. For investigators, it appeared random. And random killings are the hardest to solve. For the Griffin family, there was only grief. Ambrose's wife had watched him collapse before her eyes. His children lost their father just days after Christmas. A family shattered by a crime they could not understand. But for Richard Chase, the shooting was not enough. The act had satisfied him only for a moment. Inside his mind, the voices and delusions returned, telling him that blood was the cure, that he needed more. Ambrose Griffin would be remembered as Chase's first known victim, a man who had no connection to the killer, struck down without reason, his death marking the beginning of Sacramento's nightmare. And within weeks, Chase would escalate. No longer satisfied with firing from a distance, he would step into homes, face his victims directly, and leave behind scenes that defied imagination. The city was about to learn the name Richard Chase. Nearly a month had passed since the death of Ambrose Griffin. Sacramento had moved on, or so it seemed. Police still investigated, but the random shooting of a man in his driveway had produced few leads. To most residents, life felt stable again. The holidays had ended, schools reopened, people returned to work. But Richard Chase's mind had not quieted. His delusions deepened. He believed his stomach was shrinking. He claimed his heart stopped beating at times. He thought his body was being poisoned by outsiders, forces beyond his control. And in his mind, the only cure was blood. The day of the murder. On the morning of January 23rd, Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old newlywed, was home alone. Her husband had gone to work. Teresa was 3 months pregnant. She moved about her small home on Tioga Way, doing chores, preparing for the day, unaware that a stranger was circling the neighborhood. Richard Chase had armed himself with a .22 caliber handgun. He drove aimlessly, looking for an unlocked door. That was his rule. If the door was locked, he would not enter, believing it was a sign he was not welcome. If the door was open, he saw it as an invitation. At Teresa's house, the front door was unlocked. Chase stepped inside. Teresa was in the middle of her routine when she encountered him. There was no warning. Chase pulled his gun and shot her once in the hand, then in the head. She fell to the floor, but death was only the beginning. Chase dragged her body into a bedroom. He fetched a knife from the kitchen. With cold determination, he mutilated her. He opened her body, removed organs, and collected blood. He smeared it on himself, drank it, and carried out acts so grotesque. Investigators later struggled to put them into words. When he left, he carried with him traces of her life, her keys, blood on his clothes, and in his mind, a belief that he had sustained himself, at least for now. Later that day, Teresa's husband returned home. He opened the door to a silence that felt wrong. He called her name, and then he found her. The scene was beyond comprehension. Blood covered the walls and floor. Teresa's body lay mutilated. The violence was not just killing, it was desecration. Police arrived quickly. Detectives cataloged the details with grim precision. Spent bullets, bloody footprints, signs of dismemberment. They knew immediately this was not a robbery. Nothing valuable was taken. This was something darker. Detectives began piecing it together. The randomness of Ambrose Griffin's shooting had troubled them, but Teresa's murder was something else entirely. This was intimate, ritualistic. The killer had stayed, lingered, interacted with the body. Sacramento had a predator in its midst, but they did not yet know his name. Richard Chase was not on their radar. His arrest record was minimal, his psychiatric hospitalizations buried in medical files. To them, the killer was a shadow. Teresa Wallen was young, only 22, just starting her adult life. She and her husband had married less than 2 years earlier. They were expecting a child. Her loss left behind not just grief, but a sense of violation that spread across the city. Neighbors who once left their doors unlocked began double-checking locks at night. Women home alone felt watched. Families warned each other not to trust the safety of their neighborhoods. Teresa's death marked Richard Chase's escalation. He was no longer content with random shootings from a distance. Now, he sought blood directly. And in the weeks that followed, his frenzy would grow more violent, more chaotic, and far more devastating. January 27th, 1978. Only 4 days had passed since the murder of Teresa Wallen. Sacramento was unaware that another attack was coming, and that it would be even more devastating. Richard Chase was restless. His delusions continued. He believed his blood was evaporating. His body was collapsing from within. He roamed the streets in his car, looking for open doors, for what he called an invitation. That morning, he found one. At 27 years old, Evelyn Mirath was living in a quiet home on Marywood Drive. She was the mother of a 6-year-old son named Jason. On that day, her nephew, 22-month-old David Ferreira, was at the house as well. A family friend, Dan Meredith, had stopped by to visit. Inside the house, life was ordinary. Jason played, Evelyn cared for the baby, Dan sat nearby. It was an everyday moment of family life. But outside, Richard Chase was circling. Chase walked up to the front door. It was unlocked. He stepped inside, carrying his .22 handgun. Dan Meredith was the first to confront him. Startled by the stranger, Dan tried to intervene. Chase raised the gun and shot him in the head. Dan collapsed in the hallway. His car keys fell from his pocket, which Chase would later take. Next, Chase turned his weapon on Evelyn. He shot her once, killing her instantly. Her son Jason, just 6 years old, tried to flee to his mother's room. Chase followed and shot him as well. That left the youngest child, 22-month-old David. Chase seized him. What followed was devastation. Chase mutilated Evelyn's body, violating her as he had done with Teresa Wallen. He collected blood, consumed it, and desecrated her remains. His obsession was no longer contained. It was spilling into frenzy. When investigators later entered the house, they would describe it as one of the most violent crime scenes they had ever encountered. The 6-year-old Jason was found lifeless in his mother's bedroom. Dan Meredith was by the front hallway. Evelyn's body bore the marks of a man consumed by delusions, driven by compulsions he could not control. And the baby, David Ferreira, was missing. Neighbors became suspicious when they noticed the Meredith family car parked oddly and left running. Someone called the police. Officers entered the house, and what they found would shock them into silence. The scale of violence was undeniable. This was no burglary, no crime of passion. It was something altogether different. But what horrified them even more was the missing child. They launched a citywide alert. An infant had been taken by a killer. For 4 days, investigators searched, hoping to find him alive. But their fears were confirmed when David's body was later discovered, discarded in a box not far from Chase's apartment. The child had been murdered, mutilated, and desecrated in ways too disturbing to detail. By now, the city was in terror. In less than a month, 6 people had been murdered across 2 separate homes. The randomness of it all unsettled everyone. Chase struck without pattern, without motive, without warning. Police held press conferences urging residents to lock their doors. The public, hearing the details, realized these were not targeted killings. The killer could walk into any home at any time. Sacramento was no longer calm. It was a city under siege by a man whose name they still did not know. The Miroth family, devastated. Jason, only 6, gone in an instant. Evelyn, her life cut short. David Ferreira's parents, broken by the loss of their baby son. Dan Meredith, a friend whose final act was trying to protect the family. Each of them was pulled into Richard Chase's delusion, his violence, his unraveling. This was Chase at his peak. His frenzy had claimed not just individuals, but entire households. Yet even in this chaos, his compulsion left behind traces, fingerprints, footprints, and patterns investigators could follow. And soon, one final murder would bring him down. January 29th, 1978. Sacramento was already on edge. The massacre on Marywood Drive had left the city in fear. Parents kept children inside. Doors were locked, curtains pulled tight. But Richard Chase's compulsion did not stop. 4 days later, he killed again. That morning, Chase walked through an East Sacramento neighborhood with his .22 caliber handgun. He tested doorknobs, moving from one house to another. If a door was locked, he walked away. If it was open, he considered it permission. He eventually reached the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth's neighbor, a woman named Mary, who was alone inside. The details of what happened next would later be pieced together from evidence at the scene. Chase entered the home and shot her once, killing her instantly. He then carried out the same ritual of desecration he had begun with his earlier victims. When he left, her body was left behind, and the killer carried away items smeared with blood. But unlike before, he had been seen. Several neighbors noticed the strange, gaunt man leaving the house. They saw him drive away in a car that did not belong to him. For the first time, police had eyewitness descriptions and a clear lead. Detectives traced the abandoned car back to Richard Chase. He was already known in the area for erratic behavior, but no one had imagined the scale of violence he was capable of. With the description matching him and physical evidence linking him to the murders, police moved quickly. They obtained a warrant and surrounded his apartment. When they entered, they found a scene that confirmed their worst fears. Blood was everywhere. On the walls, the floors, the utensils. The refrigerator contained human remains. Chase had been living in filth, surrounded by the remnants of his crimes. As officers kept watch outside, Chase eventually stepped out of the building carrying a box. Inside were bloody rags and newspapers. On him, he carried the .22 caliber pistol used in the killings. Police subdued him on the spot. The Vampire of Sacramento was in custody. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Ballistics matched his gun to the murders. Fingerprints tied him to the crime scenes. Witnesses placed him at the houses. And his apartment was a crime scene in itself. At trial in 1979, prosecutors detailed the murders with grim precision. They argued that Chase understood his actions, that he chose his victims, and that he carried out each killing deliberately. The defense insisted he was insane, too delusional to comprehend the reality of what he was doing. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. They returned with a verdict of guilty on 6 counts of murder. Richard Chase was sentenced to death in the gas chamber. He never made it to execution. On December 26, 1980, less than 3 years after his conviction, guards at San Quentin State Prison found Chase dead in his cell. He had stockpiled antidepressant medication and overdosed. He was 30 years old. The murders left a permanent scar on Sacramento. Families that once felt safe no longer trusted their own homes. Parents warned their children never to leave doors unlocked. The randomness of the violence, that a man could simply test a doorknob and step into any life, haunted the community for years. For investigators, the case was a brutal reminder of how untreated mental illness can spiral into violence when combined with delusion and opportunity. For the families of Ambrose Griffin, Teresa Wallen, Evelyn Mirath, Jason Mirath, David Ferreira, and Dan Meredith, the losses could never be repaired. Richard Chase's name became infamous, not for cunning, not for planning, but for the sheer chaos of his killings. He remains remembered as the Vampire of Sacramento, a man whose madness spilled into violence and whose crimes still echo decades later. Do you think justice was served? Let us know in the comments below. Like and subscribe to Dark Matter Crimes for more updates like this.